Nishant Shah.
Thanks. All right. Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me today to talk about conditions of post-truth. So exciting. And it's going to be super exciting because, like all good people, I'm not going to talk about post-truth at all. I'm going to use the moment of the post-truth to talk about something entirely different and then hopefully lead on to it. But let me begin with a really strange personal experience I had earlier last year when I was visiting Seoul. It's a city I travel very often to, and I was at Incheon. I kind of land at the airport. There is a cab driver with my name on it, right? There's a placard which says Shah. So I just walked to him, I claim him, and I said, so take me wherever I have to go to. We get into the car, we have a nice conversation. He asks me what I'm there to do. We end up at the hotel, and I try to check in, and they said, but you are a Shah, but you are not the Shah we are expecting. Apparently, there was somebody else with the last name Shah who was supposed to be a woman traveling from Iran, who was supposed to come at the same time, and I just claimed the wrong driver. He knew he was expecting an Iranian woman, and he took an Indian man to the hotel because I claimed to be the Shah that he was waiting for. Right? It took 2 hours to figure out the entire scenario because I had to figure out where is the hotel that I am supposed to go into. The Iranian woman's freaking out at the airport because nobody's there to receive her and it's been 2 hours and she doesn't know who to get in touch with. My host is trying to call me because my driver is still waiting for me to come through and can't figure out what's happening. Right? So I want to use this particular moment of when truth did not work out. I was at some point, depending on the perspective that you have, I was an imposter. I was somebody who was imitating somebody else. At some point, I was a caricature of myself. And all I was making was a truth claim saying, I am Shah. And then there was a whole set of mechanisms that went wrong. So I want to use this specific idea of thinking of the post-truth to come to the making the truth claim or the inability to do it, to come to this bizarre and fantastic thing called truth-telling. And I want to look at some of the ways in which truth-telling has been talked about in contemporary humanities, media theories, cultural sciences, and so on. And you will realize that the philosophical meanderings of these concepts can take up all our time. So I'm not going to go into that. But I am going to try and explain this set of binary oppositions that you see flashed behind me. And I want to try and illustrate about how these ideas of the authentic, the original, and the true have been constructed for it. I hope that this is not coming as a surprise to you, that when we say that something is true, like me walking out of the airplane and saying, I am Nishant Shah, that we know that to say that something is true has very little to do with its content. Yeah? So that's my first proposition and my provocation for you for the rest of the evening. That truth-telling, the capacity to claim truthiness, the ability to claim that I am the authentic, to mark myself as an original, has very little to do with the content of my being, of my expression, or my meaning. And if that is indeed the case, then we enter into like literally an Alice down the rabbit hole kind of a labyrinth, because you now don't know what to do about it. Because that the basic premise of almost all our 20th century mechanisms of communication is the idea that content actually has truth value in it, otherwise we can produce alternative facts. Right? Because we want to complicate this notion of truth-telling, I'm going to try and take you through 4 different pillars which have been historically constructed for us in thinking about how to tell the truth and how do you make sense of it. But let me ease you into this and begin with first a set of images which I'm very fond of. Right? So behind me are 2 images, and all of you know that this is the most iconic but also the most imitated image in the world. Right? The Mona Lisa has been on everything, from mugs to underwear to hairpins to whatever else you can think about. Now, if I was to flash this image in front of you and I was to ask you to recognize the real Mona Lisa and the fake Mona Lisa, I'm presuming that we will have a consensus that the image, first image, right, the one on your left, is the real Mona Lisa, and the other one's, of course, Lisa Simpson's out of The Simpsons, which means that one is the real and the other is not. So that's the first, let's say, register of reality or authenticity that we are going to be able to put into picture. But the minute we make this particular distinction, we are getting into deep trouble. Because now I'm showing you yet another image of Mona Lisa. And now this is an image of Mona Lisa which is more original than the one I showed you earlier, because you are quickly aware that the first was a touched up reproduction, whereas this seems to be more authentic because that's literally my hand taking a picture of Mona Lisa in the Louvre as my brother is taking a picture of me taking a picture of Mona Lisa in the Louvre, and there is a recursive quality to it. Right? But for some reason, this picture, which is more blurred, it has less details, it has more, let's say, noise in its actually appearance in front of you, seems to be more authentic and more original than a closed-up picture of the Mona Lisa that I showed you earlier. When we identify this complexity, we realize that the notion of the original or the true is not absolute. Originality or truthiness, which is such a beautiful word, right? Truthiness, not truthfulness, but truthiness, as we understand it, has many different registers through which something is established as authentic and something that we can trust. And I thought that I would try and figure out how truthiness has historically been dealt with and constructed for us in specific circumstances to arrive at the notion of the post-truth. Because our idea of the Mona Lisa as an original painting is informed by old physical technologies of knowledge and cultural production. It presumes, right, and truthiness always makes these presumptions that there is only one Mona Lisa, that it is the first Mona Lisa, and that this is the only Mona Lisa that is being referenced every time somebody says Mona Lisa. Right? No matter how many different copies there might be, when you say Mona Lisa, almost like the true disciples of Plato, all of you immediately think of the ideal Mona Lisa that's being referenced, and everything else merely becomes, as Plato would say, the imitation of an imitation and possibly twice removed from reality. So the value of all the other forms, which is judged in their proximity or closeness to the original. And I want to kind of try and rethink this notion of the authentic Mona Lisa in a separate set of things by looking at 4 transitions which might be useful to you. I understand that some of these conversations might be familiar to you. Some of them are already initiated through the conversations you started this morning. So please excuse me if I'm saying something that sounds like something that you already know, but just bear with me as I take you through the entire scope of the argument. Yeah? So the 4 pillars I want to introduce to you today in terms of what constitutes truthiness of a cultural object, be it a textual object in terms of an expression, be it an artistic image, or be it different kinds of designed environments, or in fact be it news media, that there are 4 different ways by which truthiness has been established and secured to such a level that we now take it as natural. And these are the 4 pillars of authorship, authorization, authenticity, and authority. And let me take you to 4 pivotal moments in history and geography in trying to demonstrate how these things come into being. So the first story I want to kind of demonstrate, which is about the invention of author, is the production of Geoffrey Chaucer. Now, as good literate people, I hope that you know that Geoffrey Chaucer is the father of modern poetry in English. Right? He writes the first documented long-form novel, which is the Canterbury Tales, which we are all hopefully at least familiar with in form, if not in content. Because really, who wants to read Chaucer? I mean, T.S. Eliot killed him, and that was a good thing. Right. Sorry, I make bad literary references all the time. So let's go back to Chaucer, though. In the 11th and the 12th century, when Chaucer, and I'm going to keep on making air quotes every time I say Chaucer, when Chaucer was writing poetry, the Canterbury Tales is a fascinating collection. Right? So for people who are not aware of it, the Canterbury Tales is a series of stories which are being told by people who are on a pilgrimage. They are going to Canterbury from from London, and they have stopped at a bar. In that bar, on that evening, 12 different people are going to narrate 12 different stories about their lives and what they do and how they came about to be on this pilgrimage. Not all the stories survive, but some of them do. And today they are available as the folio edition of the Canterbury Tales as we circulate them. Except that Mark Rose who's one of the finest historians of reading and literature in English, has a wonderful story to tell us. He says that Geoffrey Chaucer did not exist. The Canterbury Tales were not written by one person called Geoffrey Chaucer. In fact, the Canterbury Tales were a series of stories which were being written by young men who were trained to be scribes in the Catholic Church at that particular moment, right? So one of the most highest form of literary erudition was basically when you became a poet, but when you became a scribe, when you could be trusted to copy the word of the Holy Bible from one form into the other so that the Bible could travel across the missionary routes in spreading the word of God and religion. So a whole bunch of young men, generally upper class, generally belonging to the gentry, who were being trained to write at that particular moment, were in their free time writing the Canterbury Tales. For anybody who has read any one of those tales, but especially the Wife of Bath's tale, you would realize that the Canterbury Tales was the Pornhub of the 11th century. Right? This was do-it-yourself fiction where young men were trying to kind of give fictional form to their sexual fantasies of different kinds, talking about sexual exploits, the transgression of moral codes, the ways in which the society needs to change its prurient attitudes towards the female form, and so on and so forth. So for about 100 years, the Canterbury Tales was written by scribes page after page with their hand, and it would circulate across different communities. It's just that in the 12th century, the British government passed two particular laws. One was the law against blasphemy, and the second was the law against heresy. The law against blasphemy essentially said that if you produced blasphemous content, which means content which would be judged as not moral by the doctrines of the church, then you would be held responsible of inciting corruption and moral turpitude into the society that you are writing in, right? So blasphemy, which is not just taking the God's name in vain, but also producing different kinds of sexual transgressions, perversions, excessive libidinal affective economies, was basically banned by the law. At the same time, the law also said that information which could not be sourced to the author is now going to be considered as heresy and hence blasphemous in nature, right? Which means that things which are what we would derisively call rumors or speculations, or things which cannot be sourced to one particular body, are going to now become heresy, and hence they will no longer be allowed in public circulation. As a response to the laws, Mark Rose says, as a response to these laws against blasphemy and heresy, they literally had to change the form and the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Because the Canterbury Tales were originally written as first-person narratives of this is what happened to me, and they literally changed the meter, the scansion, and the very form of the poetry, because the Canterbury Tales is about a bartender who's cleaning the bar and listening to people talking in his bar and doing reportage. Because if you report blasphemous conversation, then you are not held responsible for anything that is a problem, right? Because that's the only way you are going to be able to snitch to either the king or the church, saying, look what my neighbor said, she said this is wrong, and I have to repeat this because I'm only quoting my neighbor. So the Canterbury Tales, which is the first long-form English poem, actually got constructed in its scansion, in its meter, and its content, not by creative genius, but by laws which would otherwise have made this material punishable as a crime. At the same time, because of the law against heresy, you could no longer have an anonymous piece of information which was written and which was being circulated. And so, the clever people of the 12th century in England invented the character of Geoffrey Chaucer. Right? Geoffrey Chaucer does not exist. William Shakespeare might, but Geoffrey Chaucer definitely doesn't. It is a name that was given to a collection of texts, and which is why we don't have folio editions of the Canterbury Tales, because there are just way too many variations to actually put into place. Right? I'm going through this particular historical narrative to talk about the invention of Geoffrey Chaucer, to de-romanticize the notion of the agent who speaks, the author who writes, or the creative genius who actually makes compositions possible. While all of those things are important, it's really crucial to realize that what's at the heart of the production of authorship, not of the author, but the production of authorship is an entire system of legalization, penalization, and punishment. That an author is not just somebody who writes, an author is somebody who is held responsible for the truthiness of what has been written. That as an author, your primary responsibility is that if you say bad things will happen to you. Yeah? And that the authorship is actually a legal penal construct which is put into place. Let me combine that with a second story which is now going to talk more not just of authorship but also of authorization. Who authorizes the information and to become what it is? Who authorizes a particular expression and saying, yes, you are in fact what you claim to be? That the truthiness that you attribute to yourself is something that we identify. And the story that I have for you is from the Music and Film Industry Association of America, which without any sense of irony spells out mafia, by the way. Right? The Music and Film Industry Association of America has this specific case study of somebody called Holden Lenz. Has anybody come across this name, Holden Lenz? He is the youngest criminal to have performed acts of intellectual property rights on the internet. And I don't want to make it into a guessing game, but when he was being sued for committing acts of piracy, he was 13 months old. Right? This is Holden Lenz, and this is the face of the youngest criminal on the internet. So Holden was 13 when his mother, he was walking in the stroller. So this is just a still from the video. When his mother, Stephanie, was cooking in the kitchen, listening to music, and Holden decided that he's going to start dancing. So for 60 seconds, he's holding on to his stroller and he's just dancing and doing this. And Stephanie whipped out her phone, she recorded it, and then she put it on YouTube because, the whole point of the internet is to share pictures of dancing babies and cute cats. So she just followed the script and she put it online. 2 days after she put the video online, it got removed from YouTube because of copyright violations. She had no clue what's happening, right? It's her baby that's dancing in a kitchen. She wants it to share it with people and especially his grandparents so that they can see it. So she thinks it's a mistake. She puts it up again online. It gets removed in 24 hours. And this time, it doesn't just get removed. It comes with a legal notice from the Music and Film Industry Association, which sues her for a princely sum of $750 million for committing acts of copyright infringement. The reason why this was copyright infringement is because when she was chopping vegetables, it was Prince's Let's Go Crazy, which was playing in the video on the radio, and Holden, for bad music choices, was dancing to Prince, right? If you listen to that particular clip, you can't even hear the music. Like if I tell you that it's Prince's Let's Go Crazy playing in that clip, you will be like, what? No, not really. But an algorithm could hear what a human person could not. An algorithm, which is basically a bot that is run by a lot of internet companies, especially media streaming companies like YouTube, could identify from the wave patterns in the text that the truthiness of the text is not Holden Lenz dancing to music. The truthiness of this text is Prince's music being played and being uploaded without copyright permissions onto it. Yeah? This is a second case of thinking about how truthiness and notions of authorization come into being. What you claim, what you think there is, what the essential content is, does not really define the truth value of an object. But how it gets authorized, who authorizes it, and what are the kinds of legitimate interpretations which can be read onto it is something that we do definitely need to pay attention to. So that's the second pillar of truthiness, right? First is the production of authorship. The second is the consent and your negotiation with authorization, so to speak. The third one is actually something that's more contemporary and you're familiar with, which is Wikipedia. So we all know, for example, that Wikipedia more or less changed the ways in which we understand textual knowledge production online, to an extent where I don't know if you are bibliophiles who read dictionaries and thesauruses in your free time. I do. I have 96 different dictionaries from all around the world, and I read them for joy and pleasure. And so, when this particular event happened, it kind of there was something deep inside me which was crying. And one of the things that Wikipedia has now managed to do is that it shut down Encyclopedia Britannica's physical edition. If you like books, there are still a few copies available in the world. You might want to go and buy them because this is the last time the Encyclopedia Britannica in 2012, it's the last physical edition that they have published. And there is a reason behind it. So when Wikipedia came into the markets in 2005, a lot of people were very suspicious about it because we should be. The average editing age of a Wikipedia editor is 16. Which means that the obnoxious neighbor's kid who lives next to you, you really want to slap him or her whenever you see them, and who basically just plays loud music and does very, very strange things in his life, is editing Wikipedia and putting out the sum total of all human knowledge for all of us to reference and plagiarize from. Right? This Wikipedia was always an object of huge suspicion. In 2005, Nature, which is a fairly respectable science magazine, came and did an experiment where it selected 30 Wikipedia articles and 30 Encyclopedia Britannica articles and sent them for a deep expert peer review to figure out the rate of errors within those two. And when the results came out, it was very startling to almost everyone because of the 30 articles of Wikipedia, there were 16 substantial errors. And in the 30 articles from Encyclopedia Britannica, there were 14 substantial errors. At that point, Wikipedia was being edited largely by 16-year-olds and was running at a budget of $10,000 a year. Encyclopedia Britannica was being written by Nobel laureates, by people who are cutting-edge experts and really like honorary professors from around the world. And its annual, its 4-year publication budget is 1.2 billion pounds. Yeah. So, of course, it's also ironical that the day the Nature report came out, all the 14 substantial errors in Wikipedia disappeared within 2 hours, whereas Encyclopedia Britannica had to wait for 2.5 more years in order to rectify the errors which were in that place. So this battle between Encyclopedia Britannica and Wikipedia is interesting to kind of think about the question of authority. For too long, and especially within the humanistic traditions, we have kind of given an authorial position to the author, thinking that what the author says and what we read within that is exactly the same thing. As if truthiness of an object is essentially determined by the intentions of the author. And no matter how much we kind of, announce the death of the author, the death of the text, the death of the reader, and so on and so forth, in contemporary discourse, even now, we continue to say that the truthiness or the truth claim of an object is determined by the content and the intention that the author brings to the table, right? So if all of you had to suffer through English literature classes like I did in my undergraduate courses, you must have had some teacher who looked at you and said, that is an interesting interpretation, but that's not what Shakespeare meant. Yeah? As if my teacher had a hotline to Shakespeare saying, hey, Shaky boy, my student's saying this, what was your original intent? But it was obvious that some people have privileged access to intentions, and that comes from conditions of authority, whereas some people are always going to be delegitimized in their interpretations and their capacity to make truth claims. So if these are the three pillars that we have right now, right? So authorship, authorization, authority, and the fourth one is actually a condition of authenticity. And this is by far my most favorite story in my entire universe of book Nerdvana. So this is the story of somebody called Ashwini Bhatt. Ashwini Bhatt is a prolific translator. He writes in Gujarati, which is one of my first languages. It's spoken in the northwestern state of Gujarat, of India. It's called Gujarat. He has a readership, a small readership, not by Dutch standards. I mean, he has a readership of 45 million, but by Indian standards, that's like a very small readership, because he's writing in one of the 16 languages that India recognizes as national scripts. So Ashwini Bhatt is a prolific translator of pop fiction. He, particularly in Gujarati, became the voice of James Headley Chase. Right? He used to pick up James Headley Chase novels and he used to translate them into Gujarati. And he, for anybody who did not read Chase in English, Ashwini Bhatt was the voice of James Headley Chase. Now, because he's a very prolific translator, he translated all the 37 books that Chase has written, and then he ran out of books to translate. So then he picked up Philip Sidney, Daniel Steele, a whole bunch of other kind of paperbacks and tried to translate them, except that they all failed. It looked as if Ashwini Bhatt could only be the voice of James Headley Chase in his translation. Right? So for 5 years he tried other translations, did not work out very well, and in the 6th year he just went back to translating more James Headley Chase novels. In fact, he translated 17 more Chase novels in the next 4 years, except for one tiny problem. James Headley Chase never wrote those original novels. But Ashwini Bhatt now has more translations of Chase's novels than the novels that Chase himself has written. Yeah? This is a fascinating case. So, this is the John Gardner novel that he translated as well. This was his last flop before he went back to Chase. And so this became very interesting. At some point, James Headley Chase's estate got to know that Ashwini Bhatt is translating novels which have not been written by Chase, but is still attributing to it. And so they went and sued Ashwini Bhatt and put a cease and desist order on him, saying you are no longer allowed to translate novels which have not been written by James Headley Chase and call them translations of novels written by James Headley Chase. Yeah? Bhatt, who I actually interview in one of my fieldwork processes, looks at me very confused. He said, I don't see what the problem is. I thought that I might not be translating an author, but I'm translating a genre. That what I'm suggesting is that instead of claiming that these are works of originality, I want to give respectfully an acknowledgement that these are inspired by the universes, by the writing styles, by the different plot lines and the ways in which characters develop within those novels. And I just was really making a gesture of intertextuality there, right? So this is what I want to talk about in terms of thinking through conditions of authenticity, about how somebody was not allowed to be authentic for specific reasons which have got nothing to do with creativity or content, which has nothing even to do with intellectual property right, but essentially about conditions of trademark, conditions of competition law, conditions of property and ownership law, which navigate an entire structure of what is truthfulness and who gets to be the person who claims the truth. So through all of this, right, through all of these kind of complicated ideas, I'm suggesting to you that if we want to talk about post-truth does not mean after truth, beyond truth, beneath truth, not the truthful, and so on and so forth, except that post-truth is a new condition of truth claiming which can no longer be supported by these 4 pillars that we have identified so far. That the condition of authorship, authorization, authority, and authentication no longer work in trying to verify the truthiness of an object, and that is what it makes as post-truth. That post-truth is not a lie, it's not a non-fact, it's not an alternative reality, it's not speculation, it's none of those demonized things that we keep on kind of attributing to it. But that post-truth is a new condition which defies structures of authorship, algorithms of authorization, conditions of authentication, and points of authority. And that when you want to examine now the post-truth phenomenon, you want to actually look at how it challenges, contests, and negotiates with these different historical and material mediated practices of law, of regulation, expression, and interpretation in the way in which it unfolds. And this is not to now say that it means that we have finally reached a moment where truth no longer counts. But what we have finally reached a moment where the post-truth is no longer an aesthetic choice, but a political one. Because the post-truth movement or the post-truth expression, the capacity of something to be non-truthy or not to be validated for the truth claim that it makes for itself is now a new position which has very material consequences on life and deaths of people. And I want to end it with 2 very, very short stories to look at how the post-truth movement might actually be translating, not in terms of the content of what we are writing, but in the conditions of how we are reading. So behind me is an image which is a homage to Aaron Swartz. I don't know if Schwartz's name is familiar with you. It wouldn't be unless you were like following intellectual property rights arguments around the world. But Aaron Swartz was a 26-year-old open source activist, open access activist. Schwartz also is the internet's own child, as the documentary calls it. He is the guy who wrote the source code for Reddit, which is, as we know, the backbone of everything that's fun and bizarre on the internet. Schwartz had a very simple agenda in his life. He believed that information should be free. and that all knowledge should be freely accessible to everyone around them. He used to study at MIT, that's the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge on the East Coast in the US. And as a student at the MIT, he had access to a lot of academic and scientific material, largely available through the not-for-profit service called JSTOR, which I'm guessing almost all of you are familiar with. Yeah? So JSTOR is a not-for-profit organization which provides for academic services access to scientific data. Aaron Swartz collects all the data that he has legitimate access to. And this act of collection is seen as a criminal act which was so severe that he got persecuted by the federal government of the country, that's the US, by JSTOR, which is a not-for-profit gateway to give access to young scholars to literature and material, and by the MIT, which is considered to be one of the most leading universities that talks about open education. They persecuted him for 4 years till he finally killed himself through intimidation, through threat, through complete bullying, and not allowing him the truthiness of his action, where all he was saying was, I have legitimate right to this information, let me store it offline, which I am allowed to. The act of his storage was given a new kind of an attribution, saying if you are downloading so much information, if you are actually storing so much information, your intention is criminal, whether we can prove the criminality of it or not. Yeah? And Aaron Swartz is an example of a post-truth object, where the very act of expression, which was I want to download information that I have legal access to, was subscribed and became an intentionality which was way beyond his imagination. Right? And this is the death of a young person who we should all be mourning quite significantly. And the second story I have for you is again from India, and this is the person called Shyam Singh, and this is a fascinating story as well. So Shyam Singh used to run a photocopying shop on a Delhi University campus in New Delhi in India. So I don't know if you're from cultures where photocopying shops on university campuses are very common, but in India where infrastructure is really low, libraries are in a very bad condition, you have universities with average about 50 to 70,000 students who are all in need of the same book. The photocopying shop is the only way by which education happens. So increasingly for all of us who teach in India, every semester what we do is we create a curriculum. We take those books out of the chapters that we are reading from those books, we take those books to a photocopying shop on the campus, we tell them these are the chapters that our students have to read. The photocopying shop photocopies those chapters, puts them together as a course book, and then sells it to the students. Right? The profit per course package that the photocopying shop sells is about 5 rupees per package, which is about 0.2 cents for every sale that they make. Right? So Shyam Singh used to run a photocopying shop on the Delhi University campus, doing exactly this for multiple years. One day in 14, he woke up to be with a letter from Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, and Francis and Taylor, which run the imprint Routledge, amongst many others, suing him for $100 million for acts of copyright infringement by providing free and unauthorized access to students to materials which they need for their education. If Shyam Singh had lived in the US or in the European Union, he would have been behind bars by now. Because your countries have literally prostituted your rights of intellectual property in the name of profit making, when it should actually have a moral right of every citizen of this country to have free access to information. Fortunately, and this is not a line I say very often, India has a progressive legal system, at least when it comes to intellectual property rights. So much so that we have a fair use exception clause in the intellectual property rights debate, which allows for this kind of unauthorized access in the favor of public interest to actually be not only allowed but celebrated. The judgment that came out of the Shyam Singh court begins by saying intellectual property is not a moral or a natural right. Your capacity to transgress information, to leak it, to circulate it, to distribute it, supersedes the truthiness of the idea that there is one author, that there is only one set of authorship, that this authorship can be accessed only through a specific kind of authorization, and only when you access it through that authorized portal is this information authentic. So I like to kind of look at these two stories of Aaron Swartz and Shyam Singh to look at how new conditions of post-truth are emerging, to make the final point for the evening before I stop, that when you talk about post-truth, don't think only about the expressions of post-truth, but the body that has been being made into a post-truth body. That the circulations of truthiness, the claims that we make around truth-bearing are not merely expressions and disembodied information sets, but they are very lived and material experiences of people on the web and outside of it. And so when we talk about a post-truth universe, the political action to take is not to figure out if an orange-headed idiot is talking about the truth or the non-truth of the world, but figuring out which are the kinds of people who are being made to bear the burden of living in a post-truth society, and what are the consequences it's going to have on their conditions of life and dying, right? So I'm going to stop here, and we have then some time to questions. I can take up some of the more things I might have glossed over, and we can have a response around it. But thank you very much.